Okay, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I'll be talking to you today about tips for enhancing brief interventions, and I'm really going to focus on utilizing motivational interviewing, which is the style of counseling that has been incorporated into this model. As we go through this, I want to remind everyone what SBIRT is, and SBIRT is screening, brief intervention, referral to treatment. For those of you who are working in physical health, I want to remind you that we aren't necessarily focusing on addiction and chemical dependency. We're also looking at individuals who might be recreational users of substances, or may be someone who might be even a low-risk drinker, but their alcohol or drug consumption is exacerbating a health problem, and some change in behavior would improve their health. And so, this model really focuses on people across the entire continuum of substance use. And it utilizes motivational interviewing. It's an approach that assumes that motivation is fluid and can be influenced, that at any given time, individuals vary in their capacity to make behavior change. And it also assumes that it's influenced in the context of a relationship. Now, there's a lot said about evidence-based practice. I teach in 2 universities at Seton Hill and Waynesburg in their graduate counseling programs. And one of the things I always emphasize with my students is we have 50 years of research that tell us that what the major predictor of behavior change is the relationship between the therapist and the client. And so it's really important to recognize that the relationship that we have with the individual with whom we're working is going to be a major factor in whether they make behavior change or not. Incidentally, what the same research tells us is the personality of the therapist is a major factor in whether people change or not. And so we tend to always assume that it's the client, and if the client's willing to change. And what's important to recognize, it's who we are and how we are with the client that often has a major impact. And when we look at the spirit of motivational interviewing, it's a collaborative process. It's one in which there's interaction between the therapist and the client, and most importantly, it takes into account the client's own personal goals. One of the mistakes, and I think often what leads to anger, is that individuals enter either a healthcare setting, a mental health facility, a drug and alcohol treatment program, an educational setting, and immediately everyone tells them what they should be doing and has their own agenda, rather than recognizing that people enter these facilities with a personal agenda that needs to be addressed. That if you want someone to be invested in any kind of treatment, they must perceive that it's addressing their own recognized personal needs. It's also evocative, and this differs from cognitive behavioral therapy because emotion is something that's often evoked. The idea is that people's feelings can be a motivator for change. And it also respects someone's autonomy. And what that means is people's right to make behavior changes or to engage in behavior that we might not personally approve of. That it's people's right to make changes that, or to engage in behavior that we might see as dysfunctional, that ultimately an individual gets to determine his or her own destiny, and that often people know what's best for them in the sense that they know what works. And often what they need help from us in determining is what has worked in the past and what might work in the future. When we look at the principles of motivational interviewing, expressing empathy is critical. And if you go back to Carl Rogers and his emphasis on empathy in person-centered counseling, Rogers believed that this was a necessary component of any helping relationship. And again, if we're looking at evidence-based practice, we have 50 years of research that tell us that empathy is a critical component. And the reason being that people respond very differently to someone they perceive who understands their life experience and, most importantly, means well by them, that the interventions that are done are within the best interest of the client rather than the change agent's own personal agenda. The other thing is to develop discrepancy between what the person is currently engaging in and what they want. That a motivator for change are the hopes and dreams and desires that I have. And what can motivate a person to change is if whatever he or she is currently doing is going to undermine their ability to achieve some future goal. So it's really important to invite people to examine, is what you're currently doing going to get you where you want to be? Whether it's a health concern, it's schooling, it's having a house, being a good parent, maintaining one's relationship, staying out of the hospital. All of this, it's important that we focus on what the person wants because that's going to be their motivator. And avoiding argumentation. Getting into power struggles with clients doesn't help anyone. It undermines the process and it's counterproductive. And what's best is to roll with resistance. And resistance in this model is seen as not being ready to change rather than being obstinate or being a problem. That the reason why people are resistant is they often don't see a need for change or don't recognize it, or they have other priorities. And by shifting to what they do want and what is important to them, we're likely to make progress. In the field of addiction treatment, for years, we've said that substance use or addiction impacts all aspects of a person's life. And I think it's really important that we practice what we preach. And what I mean by that is a recognition that it doesn't matter where I start to work with someone, whatever their goals are, if it's better performance in school, if it's a better relationship, if it's getting out of legal trouble, we're going to eventually have to focus on someone's substance use because it's going to impact that aspect of their life. And if we work with where the client wants to focus, we'll naturally have to address their drug and alcohol consumption, and often they're the ones that end up addressing it. And we want to support people's self-efficacy, the belief that they're capable of doing things, they're capable of making changes, and they've been successful in the past, and they can utilize the skills that they've used and other aspects of their life to make changes in the present. What's important about these principles is they diffuse anger and they develop a therapeutic relationship. And the stronger the relationship, the least likely you're going to see clients act out with anger. Now, when we look at anger and how I'm going to define it, is it's a felt emotional state, and it typically follows an unwanted aversive interaction with others. What's really important is to recognize that the anger that the individual is expressing might be a consequence of an intervention that we've used. When I think back to my own graduate school days, one of the things Professor told my class, and I never forgot, is if an intervention doesn't work, you need to use another one. If things aren't progressing, you need to address your interventions. So when I'm working with clients and they're angry with me, the first thing I think about is what's problematic about the intervention that I used and what intervention would be more successful. Typically, when we work with drug and alcohol clients, we see their anger as their problem, and we fail to recognize it's a problem within the therapeutic relationship that we need to address. Even when they come in to treatment or they come into a setting and they're angry, often it's because they feel coerced, or there's something that recently happened that was aversive. Our job is to work with that anger, not react to it, but be proactive with it. An intervention I commonly use when a client gets angry with me is to ask them, what was it about what I said or did that made them angry, and what could I do differently in the future that would be more productive and would be more helpful. And again, that type of intervention strengthens the therapeutic alliance, because what it tells an individual is, it matters to me how you're impacted by me, and I want to be helpful. And that is an important message that people get, particularly when they've been court-ordered to treatment, because often they feel powerless and out of control. And when people feel powerless and out of control, they typically react with anger. Are there any questions so far?
Vicki, I don't have any questions yet. However, I do have a comment that somebody would like you to put this in the slideshow mode so that they can see it easier.
Okay. Let me see.
Yeah, view slideshow and then go over to the far left, well, the second one over then.
From
here.
current slide.
There
yeah,
we go.
Here we go.
Yeah,
Sorry.
I think that'll make it easier for everybody.
Okay,
but
sorry.
No questions have come in yet. Thanks a lot.
Okay. Now, and it varies in intensity, duration, frequency, body changes, distortions, and deficits. We're often working with people who have anger issues, and so it's going to be critical to develop that therapeutic relationship. Now, I like this quote because I think it's something that's always important to remember. When given a choice between changing and proving that it's not necessary, most people get busy with the proof. What that means is no one likes to change. No matter how dysfunctional current behavior is, it's comfortable, it's worked for the individual in the past, and most of us don't like to engage in new behavior because we don't know the outcome, we feel uncomfortable doing it, and we're afraid that it won't be successful. And in order for people to change, it's critical that we recognize that change requires effort, and an individual needs to believe that the outcome is going to be worth the effort. And I want to talk a bit about Prochaska and DiClemente's stages of change. The critical thing when we're working with people is to remember that we need to mirror with our interventions the stage in which a client is in his or her change process. And that oftentimes what evokes anger is that our intervention isn't appropriate. And one of the things that I think is the most difficult when one is utilizing motivational interviewing or SBIRT is to be able to identify what intervention is appropriate to what stage of change. And we're most likely going to evoke anger with our interventions if an individual is in pre-contemplation, contemplation, or preparation. The most important thing to do in pre-contemplation is to establish rapport and trust. It's to agree on direction. Anyone working with adolescents, one of the things that often happens is power struggles occur between the staff and the client. And I think we tend to forget that the developmental task of an adolescent is to begin to make adult decisions about his or her future. And when adolescents often enter treatment programs or in educational settings, the professionals fail to take into account the fact that that is the developmental task of that teenager, and that the beauty of this model is that it invites people to come up with their own solutions, to evaluate their choices, rather than telling them what they should or should not do. So it actually scaffolds or supports the adolescent developmental process. And having worked in addictions treatment for 34 years, I found that many of my clients had actually essentially were still in adolescent development even though they were adults. And what this process does is to invite people to problem solve, to come up with their own solutions, to be able to evaluate a course of action, and to make rational decisions as opposed to impulsive decisions or decisions by default. And what this also we need to do in this stage is to assess what is a person's readiness to change and to get folks thinking. In pre-contemplation, rather than tell people what action they should take, we need to understand why they're engaging in the behavior in which they currently are engaging. Because the individual in this stage sees his or her behavior as functional. It's working. He or she sees no reason to change. And if we understand the value that a person attains from engaging in that behavior, then we can begin to look at, is that behavior actually moving them in the direction of their goals, or is it moving them further away, which are the interventions for the contemplation stage. When we do psychoeducation, it's really critical that we provide factual information. One of the criticisms I have with my field is that people tend to overemphasize the dangers of substance abuse. Individuals are told that drugs are instantly addictive. There's no drug that's instantly addictive. Addiction is a process that occurs over time. Physical dependence and tolerance don't occur immediately. Every individual I've ever worked with knew people who abused a drug and never became addicted to it. And so when we present our message, what's important is that we acknowledge that some people have difficulty with a drug, become addicted to it. Provide information and then invite people to give us their reactions. What do they think about this? So rather than telling an individual what to think about the information we give them, we invite them to contemplate it. We invite them to think about it. We invite them to tell us how they respond to that information, because that also gives us critical information about where the client is and what his or her perceptions are. If we're working with someone in contemplation, we want to change extrinsic to intrinsic motivation. When people feel forced or coerced into any kind of treatment or any kind of service, it's going to automatically evoke resistance. What's so important in this stage is to identify what the underlying motivation is for the individual. If I am someone who comes to treatment because his or her parole officer told him that he or she had to, what the intrinsic motivation is for that individual is their freedom. And being free and able to make one's own choices is a value to that individual, and that should be part of our focus. It's the choice that you're making getting you closer to having control over your future or taking you further away. If an individual comes to treatment because his or her spouse nagged him or her into receiving treatment, threatened the individual with divorce, the intrinsic motivation is the value of that relationship to the individual. He or she cares about maintaining that relationship. And so that shift is a critical one because it evokes the person's own value and own motivation for change, as opposed to having them focused on it as something that's being imposed on them. We want them to look at things in terms of what they want, what's important to them, what kind of goals they want to accomplish, and what their future is. Again, when people are focusing on what matters to them, they're less likely to be angry and resistant. We want to normalize their ambivalence. No one likes to change their behavior. This behavior has been valuable to them in the past. A recognition that change might be difficult, and even thinking about change is difficult. Looking at their values, what their understanding is of change. For so many people, change feels overwhelming because the assumption is you have to make 100% change and never ever backslide into old behavior. You know, I think about folks with eating disorders or individuals who are overweight and are told that they have to reduce their salt intake, reduce their calorie intake, reduce the amount of sugar that they're eating, and also exercise. Doing those 4 things at once feels overwhelming. But asking an individual, what kind of change can you make now that's doable for you, that'll improve your health or well-being, and it can be any kind of small change in the direction of health, feels doable for people. particularly when we're working with people who have limited resources and limited resilience. It's really critical that we invite people to consider change that's possible for them, and having them explore and set goals, and experimenting. Oftentimes, folks working with alcoholics or addicts are hesitant to suggest tapering down or trial moderation, with the assumption that the person can't do this, so why bother even suggesting this? For many people, it may be important that they attempt to taper down or try trial moderation before they can come to the conclusion that abstinence might be the best option for them. There are other individuals who can taper down and can moderate their consumption. When we're looking at problem users, tapering down for many is a possibility. I think about often when you're working with mental health clients, after they've been successful on medication for a while, they stop. The reason is many people need to test, do I in fact need to take this medication? No one likes to believe that their health and well-being is dependent on an external substance. And so oftentimes people will attempt to do this because they need to prove to themselves that either they need to take their medication. In the case of substance abusers, it's the belief that I can control my consumption, and they may need to engage in this experimental behavior in order to come to the conclusion that they may not be successful. There was a study done with alcoholics where they were invited to taper down, and 80% came to the conclusion that that was impossible and that abstinence was the only option. But what was important about this is a conclusion they came to on their own. It wasn't something that someone told them. And taking small steps, envisioning what your future might look like if you tried a new behavior. In preparation, our intervention should be about negotiating a plan for change, offering people a menu of change options. Oftentimes, individuals become angry and frustrated because they aren't given choices. In my example of someone who is overweight and needs to lose weight, asking them, could you reduce your salt intake? Or could you possibly reduce your sugar consumption? Is exercise a possibility? Giving them an option, which of those things do you think that you can do? People are much more receptive to making changes. Lowering, talking about what are potential barriers, anticipating some problems, enlisting support. You notice nowhere in pre-contemplation, contemplation is giving advice an option. And the reason for that is advice is something that belongs in a stage when people are preparing to change or have decided to make a change. When a person hasn't identified whether a change is something he or she wants to make, advice is often unwelcome. And so when giving advice, it's best to ask someone if it's all right to do that, to ask for permission. And again, it gives the client a sense of control and diffuses resistance and often anger. The MI techniques of affirmation are really important. I used to run an anger management group, and I would have people who would come to my group who were obviously angry and obviously had a problem with anger. They denied that they had a problem, and they were there because someone made them come. The first thing that I did is affirm the fact that nobody likes to be forced to come anywhere. So I would say to folks, I don't blame you for being angry. I would be angry if someone made me come here. And given you're stuck coming to see me, how can we make our time together productive for you? What can we do so that you don't feel that this is a waste of your time? Again, what this is doing is affirming the person's experience, affirming their right to make life choices, and also inviting people to engage in a collaboration with you that will meet their needs. Affirming folks' skills and their abilities, their right to make choices, that the fact that they use substances for what they perceive are good reasons is critical in this process because it says, again, that you understand the individual, that you recognize he or she is engaging in behavior that he or she believes is conducive to their well-being, and that an individual has some investment in themselves and their future. The very fact that they showed up means that they care about themselves. If people walk into a doctor's office, it means that he or she cares about their health. If somebody comes to a treatment program because a PO said you either go to treatment or go to jail, that's a positive action. Treatment is better than going back to jail. So that individual has some concern about his or her welfare. And that needs to be acknowledged. And again, by acknowledging that, what we do is to build that therapeutic alliance. This technique focuses on reflective listening as opposed to open-ended questions. While open-ended questions are used, the emphasis is on reflective technique. An important thing about reflective technique is it only works when you're authentic, when you are truly empathic. I can think of nothing that evokes anger in me more quickly than when someone uses reflective technique and I know they could care less about me or what happens to me. And if you think about a time when you were dealing with someone around a problem, be it your wireless phone company or your cable company, and they've obviously trained people on the other end to use reflective technique, and the individual is inauthentic, it's obvious that they're reading something off of a card and how it impacts you. Reflective technique works when we really listen to people and when we're empathic. Level 1 reflections are mirroring exactly what the person said, and they should only be used when we don't have any information to do more in-depth reflections. Nobody likes to be parroted, and I think oftentimes why people get angry in response to reflective technique is the individual is simply parroting what the client just said. Good reflective technique requires that we hear the underlying message in what someone said and reflect it back to them. When they do that, an individual feels heard and understood, and believes that the person that they're speaking to is invested in understanding and helping him or her. And I think this is one of the most critical things to remember about a motivational interviewing intervention, is it really requires that one hear the individual and try and understand them for his or her perspective. Arguing and expressing anger is a common form of client resistance. It's in challenging what the person says, discounting it, or downright hostility. The motivational interviewing techniques are designed to diffuse that and roll with the resistance. And the techniques specifically that are designed to do that are things like simple reflection and amplified reflection, where one exaggerates what the person says. So if I have an individual who says, I can handle substances, I don't know why I have to be here, an amplified reflection would be, you've never had a problem connected with your substance abuse. It's never interfered in any way with your life. When doing an amplified reflection, it needs to be in a simple tone of voice, like one would do any kind of reflection. Anything that implies sarcasm or disbelief is only going to evoke anger. So my reflection would be, up until this time, your substance use hasn't interfered in any way with your life. You notice there's no sarcasm, there's no disbelief in that statement. And oftentimes, what it will evoke is the opposite. Well, that's not necessarily true. And then we can talk about when are the times it has been problematic. With a double-sided reflection, what we're doing is presenting someone with conflicting information. You like to drink, and at the same time, it's exacerbating your acid reflux. What are you going to do? So you're presenting the individual with a conflict and asking them, how do you plan on resolving this? Or what kind of resolution can you think of? Shifting the focus is moving from what the person doesn't want to talk about to what they do want to talk about. Again, trusting that if I shift the focus and I build a better relationship and we work together, we're eventually going to have to address the substance use. An agreement with a twist is acknowledging the accuracy of what the person says and throwing in kind of like a little curveball. So if I say to somebody, up until this time, you've been able to deal with your husband's anger, and yet it's becoming harder and harder to do so. Or, you've been in prison, you know how to do the time, and yet it's getting more and more difficult to avoid conflict in a prison setting. Or you're experiencing increasing concerns about time spent in prison. Reframing, shifting from your wife is nagging to your wife appears to have some concern for you. These are all ways of dealing with resistance and can diffuse anger, because I see anger often as an expression of resistance. They're ways of working with people that avoid a power struggle, that avoid the individual feeling in control and invite people to reflect further. Any questions about the information that I've presented?
Excuse me. Yes, Vicki, one did come in. They say when asking about a person's motivation for using a substance, how do you approach that?
I would ask someone, what do you like about using drugs? What do you like about heroin? And then I would use reflective technique to acknowledge and affirm that this individual has had those positive responses. Using heroin is an excellent way of reducing stress because it shuts down the stress response. It can become a way of people engaging socially with others. It is a way of, for many people, of feeling pleasure that they've never felt before. After I explore with someone what they like about what they're doing, then I would invite them to share what's the downside. And you notice I don't say what's bad, because I think when you ask someone what's bad about what you're doing, what happens is the individual hears it's not okay to do that, and it sets up resistance. But if you say what's the downside of what you're doing, everything has a downside. It isn't as threatening a question, and then explore with someone. And then ask, how does this fit in with what you want in your life? When you look at your future plans and where you imagine yourself being 2 years from now, is your drug use going to get you closer to where you want to be or further away?
There's another question, Chris. You want me to read it?
Yes, please.
It's Vicki, do you find it more difficult to work with mandated clients than clients who are not mandated? And they asked if you could go back to the slide with the quote.
Okay. I've worked primarily with court-mandated clients. And so that's a client base I've mainly worked with. And when I worked in drug and alcohol treatment, most of my clients were from medium and maximum security prisons. It's actually the client base I like to work with best. And when I ran anger management groups, most of my folks were court-ordered. And I found using motivational interviewing, I was able to quickly develop a relationship with folks, and no matter how resistant they were initially, over the weeks that resistance broke down. And when I ran my anger management groups, I had almost a 90% attendance rate. People came and they got invested. And a large part of it was I didn't make anyone acknowledge they had an anger issue. What I invited them to look at was were there more effective ways of dealing with others that they could use to avoid conflict, no matter what the reason that they came to the group. And what I found was a number of individuals who didn't think they had a problem soon recognized that they did. In my private practice, I've worked with a number of college students who initially came into counseling stating that they had no intention to stop their drug or alcohol consumption. And so I worked using this model and harm reduction, and I found that eventually all of my students came to the conclusion that they needed to make significant behavior change because it was interfering in terms of their drug and alcohol consumption, because it was interfering with their goals. So what we find in research is we have better outcomes with court-mandated people in terms of drug and alcohol treatment than we do with people who are voluntary, because there's motivation to change.
Right, even if it's negative,
Yes.
coming from sort of punitive angle.
Exactly, the desire. And I think, again, what engages this population is they're in a system that's trying to control them. And when you use this model, you're giving them control. And they're far more receptive to it because it's different than what they typically encounter in most service settings, because people are always telling them what they should do, and then what they're doing is bad and it's stupid. And I think it's refreshing to have someone recognize that the reason you do this is you actually perceive this is good for you. Because a lot of times this is something,
that's great.
Yeah, they've never heard. I believe people do not engage in self-defeating behavior. They engage in behavior that they perceive is good for them and don't recognize the ways that it's dysfunctional. And that if they can be invited to explore that, they often make better choices. This is a model that believes that people have a capacity to change. And I think that in and of itself motivates people. That when you're working with someone who respects you, thinks well of you, believes that you're capable of making good choices, people kind of rise to the expectations that we have often. And I've seen that particularly with criminal justice clients.
I would agree with that. Thank you, Vicki. This is just one more question. This is my own question, actually. So the last slide, you had given us some techniques for dealing with resistant client. If you could go back to that one.
Sure.
That's the very last slide. So I was,
whoops.
We only have like a minute or so. And I know Chris has some things to do at the end of the webinar, some logistics. I don't see other questions, but as we're talking, if people are thinking of things, you want to put them in the chat or questions panel, we certainly have time.
Yeah, there we go.
So I'm wondering, these are what you would recommend as really good techniques that are based in the principles of motivational interviewing that in particular, well, they help overall in conversations and brief dialogues with patients and clients, but in particular they're helpful in the situation of a person who is actively expressing anger.
Yes, because I believe, again, I want to emphasize, when people are expressing anger, they either feel out of control or something that you've just done with them has offended them, alienated them. And these kind of techniques are reflecting back to the individual what he or she said. And it's inviting them to think about it. And I think one of the things that's really important to remember about motivational interviewing is that it is a technique that really is designed to avoid creating anger in the client and creating resistance. And what, if there was one thing I would wish that people took away from this webinar, is if someone is angry, to think first, what made them angry and what could I do differently that would help this individual be more responsive. To always look at what's problematic about my intervention as opposed to what's problematic about the individual. And when you have no clue about what would work, ask the person. Anytime I've asked a client, what could I do that would be more helpful or effective for you? They've often given me really good information and really good feedback. So people often know what works with them and what would be helpful. And so I think it's really important to ask, if you don't know, what would work better for you. And for some people it might be, I don't want to be here. And it might be because at this time in their life they're not ready for change. and that we might need to respect that.
And even just acknowledge it.
Yes. And say, you know, if you change your mind, I'm here, leave the door open.
Right. Well, I know, Chris, thank you, Vicki. That was a great reminder about how we can deal with, in particular, with resistance and anger, and a very good overview of what are the components of a brief intervention, and that it's based on the principles and techniques of motivational interviewing. So I know Chris has a few things she wants to do.
And we do have a comment from somebody that I think just adds to Vicki's webinar. It says motivational interviewing can only improve with practice since engagement is voluntary. What are the ways you can practice MI techniques? There is a question in there too.
There's actually a wonderful workbook called a workbook for motivational interviewing techniques. You can get it on Amazon. Rogengren, I believe, is the author, and it's paper and pencil activities where you practice doing the technique. You practice asking open-ended questions that move the discussion in the direction of change. Of all the resources I've seen, I think that is the most skill-focused. And there's a lot of information in that workbook, and I would highly recommend it.
Thank you. I will get the link to that and put it in the webinar email that I'll be sending out to all attendees tomorrow morning. That email will also have the evaluation in it and information on getting CEUs. So look for that from me tomorrow. And I said I'll be sure to put this in. Okay, well, thank you so much, Vicki. I am going to take the screen back now. I appreciate your doing this.
Thank you, Chris.
Okay, before everybody signs off, I would like to take you on a brief tour of the National SBIRT ATTC website. Here we go. This is our website, and you can get to it by going to attcnetwork.org/SBIRT, and I'll have this link in the email tomorrow. I just want to give you a really brief overview of this because there's a lot of information that you can use here. This is our home page, and on it we have right now we're showing a brief overview of the Pacific Southwest curriculum. That's about a 5-minute short webinar, and also a link to the curriculum. You can also click on share slide, share about our strategic plan, and we also have one of our downloadable products right here on the main screen too. Now, on the side, there are some other items that you'll be interested in. There's a calendar that lists our trainings, and you can see the webinar lineup there as well as on the webinar site. And products and resources, in addition to other ATTC items, we're showing our products here too. You can go right to the webinar library. A toolkit, which has a lot of the screens and a lot of the materials that are mentioned in our webinars. Here's the screenshot again, and here's a link right to the webinar site. Now, if you're looking for trainers in your area, we have those listed. You can either put in a name if you know somebody, a state, or just click on your region, and you'll see all the trainers in your region, and then you can just click on that for detailed information. So these are all trainers that we feel are qualified to train SBIRT. Now, in addition, we have some digital tools like the small webinar on the front about the SBIRT curriculum. We're going to be coming out with some other new tools shortly. This is a new item for us, so this library will also grow as we add more to it. We are very fortunate to be working with NORC at the University of Chicago. They're one of our partners, and they also have a list of really great webinars coming up, which are also listed on our webinar screen. And they also have their own webinar library. Now for distance learning, we do have courses available through other ATTCs, and you can look at those if you're looking for just foundations of SBIRT, or they have one here for dentistry, and then here's another, employee assistance professionals. And of course our SBIRT webinars that are available through here, this link, and then through our main webinar page. Now we also have e-news, and I don't know if you're aware of this, but we have our own SBIRT Alert newsletter that comes out occasionally. It's an occasional newsletter. It comes out about once a month or so, and you can subscribe right from this panel. That will take you to subscribe, or you can just click on the panel and it will take you right to the current SBIRT Alert, which describes some upcoming webinars, upcoming events, and some tools. You can also subscribe here. There's national interest and local interest. So this is another good resource for you to use. Here's a subscribe button for this too, as well as other information that you can link to. So this is a really valuable resource. Now, this also shows our advisory board and how to contact anyone here. If you are in other parts of the country, you can go find your local ATTC region, and again, click on the region of the country that you're in, and it will give you the contact information for your region. Here it is for Pacific Southwest. So this is a really, really valuable resource for you, and we hope you will take advantage of it and visit our network. Visit our network, and also let us know what you think about it and what you'd like to see added. So I think that's the overview that I'd like to show you. Please send me your comments. Look for our email to you tomorrow morning. Again, it will have the links for the CEUs and for the online viewing and downloads of the slides. So thank you very much, and at this time we will close out the webinar.